Hello, welcome to Sociology. This is Chapter 1, the Sociological Perspective. We're going to talk about what sociology is, some of the perspectives, history, sociologists, etc. So please take the title card down at this time, and then we'll get started. So first, we have to talk about kind of the broader context of sociology, right? So sociologists look at society, a group of people who share a culture and a territory, and try to do that through a sociological perspective, right? A lot of this is asking the question, why? Our goal is to kind of open windows into unfamiliar worlds. So we're going to look at a lot of different situation scenarios, from Nazis in Germany to warriors in South America, right, to people who literally live in a city dump. Those all exist, and our question is why. Why did these things happen? Why do these people exist? Why do they make these choices, etc.? So, we it's not just a focus on specific groups, but kind of the reason for that action. So we want to know what maybe those differences are, right? So if we took like a newborn from the United States and placed them in a jungle in South America, their lives would be extremely different, right? They would not probably want a cell phone when they grow up. But if they grew up in America, they probably would, right? So those are sociological differences, and that's kind of what we're going to be looking at within this. So, if you've been in psychology, then kind of the difference between social sciences and natural sciences. So sociology is another social science, and so we still follow the scientific method, go through that process, a process I think most of you are familiar with, but we'll rehash at some point as well. So make sure you know the differences between those two, natural sciences and social sciences, but that's kind of the case. So just to kind of hit on that a little bit more, of the goals of science. Once again, I think you probably had experience with this, especially if you've been in psychology already. But our goal is to move beyond common sense. We look at society and ask those why questions, from the simple to the complex. So from the really big, why does poverty exist, to the really small, why do you only shake hands with people when you first meet them, or kind of meet them again, but not friends or family that you're familiar with? We look at those things and ask those why questions. We're going to apply the scientific method, right? We're going to develop hypothesis. We're going to test that hypothesis, and we really want to apply that to areas of tradition. Sociology really takes that tradition. Why do we do it? Oh, well, that's just how it's always been, right? So sociology's really goal is to say, why has it always been that way? Like, let's actually explain what these things are. So we're going to kind of test those assumptions, and we'll look at big things. We'll look at revolutions and social orders, and small things, right? Of what happens in your day-to-day life. Why are there certain social protocols in school? How do the social protocols at Keystone Oaks differ from the social protocols at Mount Lebanon or Seton, right? Why are there differences? Those are all things that we can explore with sociology. And we'll get a little bit deeper into the history. I'll have you really pick one of these people and get into them a little bit more. But sociology, the history goes back to the 19th century, and many different people have been different things. Auguste Comte is kind of the founder of sociology, and so he really started to analyze this kind of basis of social order through what he called positivism. And so, his reflection was on the French Revolution. That's really what kind of kicked off sociology and the changes that happened when he kind of moved from Paris to a smaller town in France, seeing, okay, what are the reasons for it, right? It's kind of the study of society. He wanted to try to apply the scientific method to society. Herbert Spencer was an advocate of social Darwinism, from England, and so he kind of called this the survival of the fittest, right? And so, for example, he didn't think you should help the poor, and he thought, hey, if people aren't fit enough, they can't make it, then they should just die, and no one should help them, right? So, so it's kind of this philosophy. Not him and Comte didn't really do actual scientific study, and so Darwinism eventually was discredited, right? But this did kick in a lot of people to say, let's look further into this. So he gets included. And kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum is Karl Marx. He wrote the Communist Manifesto and was a proponent of basically, the father of communism, right? And so his proposal was more for a radical revolution, class conflict, the bourgeoisie, kind of the capitalists that own the capital, and then the proletariat, the exploited workers, and eventually that proletariat would rise up and take out the bourgeoisie and do that. And so it was a very sociological issue. Now, Karl Marx, unlike the other two, didn't think of himself as a sociologist, but that's what he was doing. He was doing class conflict and conflict theory, a lot of things that have been studied further and continue today. So Emile Durkheim, social integration, so he was a sociologist, and he kind of viewed sociology as part of history, part of economics, which it is, among other things. So he wanted to show how social forces affect people's behavior. That's a lot of what we do. And so social integration is the degree to which members of a group feel united by shared values or other bonds, right? The social cohesion. How do we relate to each other through that? So, it's something like a cult. It's not always positive, but something like a cult and, a cult encouraging suicide, these bonds to the social group can people do that? It's something that we'll explore. So, then Max Weber here, Max Weber, I guess would be a more appropriate way to say it, German sociologist, and he kind of took, Durkheim's ideas and he kind of went in a more capitalist direction, right? So he was kind of anti-Karl Marx, and so he felt like he put it in religion, essentially. The Protestant faith would encourage more, change versus Catholicism that didn't, and he was in a time of capitalism flourishing and split in the Christian church, and so he really hit on some of these things. So all of you explore one of these people further, and we do have kind of go a little bit more in depth into this. Is Weber's use of what he called Verstahen, if I'm saying that correctly, Verstehen. It's a German word that translates roughly to to have insight into someone's situation, right? So that's really our goal, right? He wanted to interpret human behavior, even though there's some subjectivity to that. The meaning that people give to their behavior might not always be what understands. So, So, for example, we might compare two groups of people and ask, just why are they different, right? We might look at someone who's homeless, that's not saying much, is very quiet. Why are they different from someone else, on the street, right? And so you can maybe it's you interview people and you understand what those differences are. So something we'll kind of apply. That's Verstahen. Maybe we'll watch something on that later. Then in contrast, Durkheim's social facts is another way to look at things as well. Basically, like a group has a certain pattern of behavior. So, for example, weddings, the most common month for weddings is June. Suicidal rates are higher among the elderly, right? More births occur on a Tuesday. So these are kind of overarching statistics, and us exploring why those occur. So we have to use kind of social facts to interpret what these statistics are. Okay, why do most weddings happen in June? The weather's nicer, kids are out of school. It's usually a time when people are more able to do that. So both of these can work together, even though they're different. And so we can look at the individual. We can look at the homeless person that's silent, is kind of in despair and doesn't want to be noticed. And that might be a very specific thing to that one person. And social facts we can use to do that as well. Next slide. We also have some underappreciated sociologists. There's a lot of women in sociology that were underappreciated. I'll kind of start there. Jane Addams, the Hull House. She opened a Hull House to help the poor and study immigrants and how they adjusted to life. Ida B. Wells was someone who was a writer, kind of exposed some of those truths. Frances Perkins, first female cabinet member, labor-related. So each of these women, and there's a lot more in the text as well, who had a hand in different areas of sociology. And so a lot of women were kind of the forgotten sociologists of the 19th century, early 20th century. And some to know. There's also some underappreciated sociologists in terms of race. W.B. Du Bois, who helped start the NAACP, was a sociologist essentially by trade. He really studied racism in America and why it exists, where it exists, how it persists, and how to kind of deal with that, right? And so. So he was someone who started his own group in the NAACP to combat racism as a journalist, as a sociologist, and try to address these underlying issues to do that. So I think that needs to be said as well. We also have some different contrasting views: Talcott Parsons versus C. Wright Mills. So they were in the 20s and 30s in America, studying things like crime and drug addiction and juvenile delinquency and prostitution, and how to alleviate these social problems. So we have like Parsons definitely wanted to address these bigger problems, kind of this theoretical way of, okay, how can we make these better? And Mills wanted sociologists to get back to kind of social reform and try to help in that way. So he kind of focused on the power of the elite, right? That the government, the military can address these, whereas Parsons was more of individually, how can we address these? So different ways of looking at how to address problems. That brings us to basic versus applied sociology. These are two different schools of sociology that focus on two different areas, right? Basic sociology is, our goal is just to find out that these things exist. That Talcott Parsons would say okay, prostitution is on the rise here, here, and here, and we figured out why. Here's the reason. That's it. Right? C. Wright Mills was more in the applied area. He wanted to solve problems with sociology. Okay, if crime is up, how do we apply what we've learned to change it? What can the government do? What can we do to do that? So kind of social activism through sociology. Applied sociology can have some problems with bias, right? We're kind of saying this is right, this is wrong. Kind of saying more crime is bad. That might seem like a thing that makes a lot of sense, right? But what if it's not, right? What if, once again, someone like Talcott Parsons, who really rose up during Prohibition, maybe more crime isn't bad during Prohibition. We just want to say that it is. So there's a lot of debate of what sociology should be. Should we address these issues or not? That's the question. And then we'll talk about some theoretical perspectives, some different things that are a little more theory based than necessarily applied, right? So like symbolic interactionism is one of your vocabulary words. That basically society is composed of symbols. The symbols are important, and that's really what drives what we do. It's things like parenting, marriage, divorce, love. Maybe these things aren't real. Marriage, quote unquote, is kind of a social construct, right? Divorce doesn't really matter, and it has a lot of meaning, right? When people get married, there's a lot of emotions there. I've gotten married. It's a great day. It's a very emotional day, right? And people get divorced, and it hurts, and there's problems, but the symbolic theory says this is a symbol kind of created by society, and so that's something we'll explore a little bit. Functional analysis is kind of the theoretical framework, in which society is viewed as composed of various parts, right? So we have different functions in our society. This is functionalism. And we're going to go more in depth into these three later in this chapter in the class as well. So, I'm not going to jump wholly in right now, but functionalism is these kind of functional parts, right? A person, we're built of organs and skin and bones. Functional analysis, that society is made up of all these different pieces within that, right? So we'll get into that a little bit more later. And then we have conflict theory, which, like I said, is a little more in the Karl Marx area. That society is composed of groups that are competing for resources, right? So this is where you get class conflict. There's a pool of money. Everyone wants money. How does it get distributed? How do we deal with that? So this kind of gets into Marxism a bit. So we'll get more into these as time goes on. The last slide is macro sociology versus micro sociology. Macro sociology looks at the whole, all right? It looks at the kind of big picture, social interaction, large scale patterns, whereas like functionalists, conflict theorists, they would be more macro, whereas the symbolic interactionists would be more micro. They focus on social interaction. They focus on what each individual person is doing, what people do when other people are around, instead of this big kind of picture. So we'll talk more about that. So macro look more at statistics, more functions, more changes. Micro is going to focus on what individuals do. And sociology, is global. We can kind of take it to different areas of the world, right? So we'll explore things like the globalization of capitalism. How does capitalism hook on in the world? How does it affect people, etc. Things like that. So a real brief overview. I hit on a lot of stuff, but hopefully it makes some sense. I appreciate it, and I will see you to talk about all this in more detail soon.